Hello everyone, this is Wood on Peers, and this is the first of maybe 5 or 6 videos where I want to give you an idea of what the House of Lords is like today. In this first video, I want to talk about the composition of the House of Lords, who makes it up. And I should say that when people started looking at the history of Parliament in the 17th century, this was for very politically interested reasons. Essentially, this was during the Civil War. People were trying to justify the membership of Parliament, either that the House of Commons was totally integral to Parliament, or, a little bit later on, that certain writs of summons, very early writs of summons to the House of Lords, were to real parliaments, and that therefore these descendants of people to whom these summons were issued could gain hereditary titles by proving that these people were really there. There's a lot of very politically interested research done in this area, and I really want to point that out, that this is politically interested, and also that you really can't separate the membership of Parliament from its functions or powers. Unfortunately, in this video, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I will go a little bit into its functions, but the thing with Parliament is that it's very difficult, I find, to rationalise it. It's not as though it's set out in one great constitution or anything like that. It's very much a long series of political and literal battles that have resulted in what it is now, who's a part of it, and what it does. Bearing all that in mind, let's start by talking about who makes up the House of Lords today. And when I say today, I mean just before the remaining hereditary peers are kicked out. And I want to get this video out just before then. Who are members of the House of Lords today? Today, you can divide the membership of the House of Lords into 4 main types, and we'll go through each one of those. Firstly, you have the Lords Spiritual. Secondly, you have the hereditary peers. Thirdly, you have the life peers. And finally, a sort of miscellaneous class of office holders, which isn't really so much of a category, but which I think makes sense to include. So let us get started. Firstly, the Lords Spiritual. Who are they? Well, they are 26 bishops of the Church of England. 5 of them have their position ex officio, so that's the 2 archbishops, and then the bishops of Winchester, London and Durham. And the remaining 21 are by length of service as a bishop. There are just over 40 bishops in the Church of England, as in bishops of diocese. There are assistant bishops, but we won't go into those. And in order to be a Lord Spiritual, you need to be one of the 21 longest serving of these bishops. However, there's a change with women that I'll come to later. But why are there Lords Spiritual? Well, to answer that question, we need to go a very, very long way back. Before Parliament, essentially. It's difficult to draw direct comparisons from this, but Tacitus has a fantastic description of the organisation of Germanic tribes in the late 1st century AD. These tribes would gather together and, as he mentions in his description, they would be shushed by their priests. There have always been priests, it seems, in gatherings of the people. Now, much later on, and again, this is the part where it's difficult to draw a direct comparison, in the councils of wise men, in the early 7th century, this is 629, I believe, the Venerable Bede describes the conversion of the people of Northumbria. This was done after the king took counsel with his advisors, and this council of wise men, called by some the Witan in the Saxon, is one of the predecessor institutions that led eventually to Parliament. Now, what's important about this is that Bede gives the description that the pagan chief priest of the Northumbrian people spoke first in this council. Now, I don't want to rely 100% on Bede as telling the literal truth, but what's important to note is that pagan priests regularly gave Saxon kings advice. Now, if we go back even further, we can see this is back to the time of Julius Caesar's writing, so before the coming of Christ on earth. The Druids, who were religious officials, they had roles in sacrifice, were also involved in resolving disputes. It's difficult to jump back and forward so many centuries and expect there to be any serious continuity, and I'm not trying to claim that there is a direct line, but what's important to note is that people with religious roles have always had their place in the councils of nations and peoples. This has been going on since as long as we are aware of these councils. What happened, though, with the Anglican Church? Well, when the Northumbrians converted to Anglicanism in the 7th century, bishop replaced the priest. I like to think because they were respected as holy men. These are some of the great men of the realm who are called on to give advice and provide a greater significance that only really religion can give to certain occasions. Bishops would crown kings as well, for example, and, as I said, being educated, they played a large role in the machinery of government for many centuries. They were almost all of the early chancellors, which is a role that I will talk about later at the end of this video. Some of you might still not be convinced. You might say, well, why specifically Anglican bishops? Why not anyone else? Or why them at all? The Church's official position is that they want to expand the religious representation in Parliament, not just to be the official state church, but others too.
Some of us on these benches would prefer, so much prefer, to work towards a broadening of the establishment.
And it is true that, for example, the chief rabbis of the congregations of the Commonwealth have recently been given life peerages. So there's some attempt to do this. It's noted that Roman Catholic priests and bishops will never agree to serve under another government than that of the Vatican. It is forbidden in their Roman canon law. So it would be currently impossible for them to accept any positions in the House of Lords. But let's get down to the real nub of the argument. Why are there bishops in the Lords? Well, if we look back, as I said, to the conversions of the Saxon kingdoms before the Norman conquest and before united England, in fact, we can see that they were each a people that had a religion, a way of doing things. They had one king most of the time. They had one council, although again its membership could be very varied. They had one religion. And ignoring all this sort of post-French Revolution, Enlightenment, abstract ideas of citizenship, we are inheritors of this very ancient idea. Our national council is now Parliament. We have one king, and therefore the Anglican Church is our religion. That's why there are bishops in the House of Lords. Now, I need to caveat this a lot. I suppose some might say that, well, we should convert to a foreign religion, or perhaps disagree with the idea of religion at all. But what I would say is, one of the roles of religion is to preserve ideas, teachings, and doctrines and philosophies. And if you look at what we value in Britain, and if you look at these qualities, they are Christian qualities. We abhor slavery, for example. We believe in the dignity of individual human beings. We value self-sacrifice. We value forgiveness. We approve of the teaching, I think, as an ideal that not only are we to love our neighbours, but our enemies. All of these things are explicitly Christian teaching, and I will say there are many other religions that don't teach this, that are fine with slavery, that are happy to teach you to hate your enemies, that don't talk about passive or non-violent sacrifice, but about a more active, violent form of confrontation. So I would just say that the values that have been propagated, that have seeped into British society over the centuries, are Christian values. The other thing I would say is that religion is not just something that you place on top of society. I've mentioned that these values and teachings have formed aspects of what is considered the sort of British values, but religion, and specifically the church in England and Wales as was, and similarly the Scots Kirk, and that's to say nothing of the churches in Northern Ireland, have all played very active roles in British political history. There's the separation of the jurisdiction of appeals to the Bishop of Rome. There are enormous other number of denominations that have come from the established church or established churches. A lot of these teachings and ideas are now expressed, in fact, in secular ways. Again, I would say that if you go back far enough, you'll find that being Christian is our religion. The way that the political vicissitudes of the centuries have taken their toll on the organization of the church, of course, can't be ignored. It's very apparent. That's why we have a specifically Anglican church. That's why, for example, the church is disestablished in Wales and now Northern Ireland. That is why the Scots have taken their decision of having presbyters instead of bishops. All of these things can't be ignored and are sort of difficult, I suppose, to justify from a sort of blank slate philosophical point of view. But through all of these political changes, the general culture and values are Christian, even though we have declining church attendance. Ask people what values they have, what their worldview is. For example, that the world was created. For example, that it is through our own choice of free will that we need to choose to do the right thing. I won't go into this anymore, but I simply want to make the point that Christianity is our religion and has been for hundreds of years. Yes, there are specific political disagreements and battles that many of you will be on the other side of with regards to the established Anglican Church. But the reason we have bishops in the House of Lords is not only that it is our religion, as I keep saying, but look around you. Even if you're not Anglican, even if you're not Christian, many of the values in Britain are Christian. But let us speak a little bit of the history. Initially, bishops would give advice to the various kings of whose people they were bishop. All throughout the centuries of Christianization following the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury, there were many, many monasteries that were established, and over the centuries they gained great wealth. Also, being seats of learning and education, their abbots or their priors were very learned and powerful as well. I'm skating over a lot of this history, but both in terms of wanting advice from learned men, but also in terms of wanting taxation to pay for wars, these abbots or these monasteries, who would send either their abbots or a representative, were also summoned to the king's councils and parliaments. And for this I need to do a little aside. The main purpose of Parliament, or the main structure of the early parliaments in this, let's say, the 13th century, was that the king wanted a certain amount of taxation that he couldn't get through his feudal structure. Now, for example, if you have a liege lord who you're sworn to, you will do good by him and he will look after you. That's the political feudal compact. Then again, I don't want to critique the idea of feudalism too much, of course. I know it is anachronistic, really, to speak of it. But if the king wanted a certain levy for a war or something like that, while possibly under the stronger, earlier Norman kings he could do this, later there was enough pushback that the only things that he could really request money for were ransoming his own body, knighting of his eldest son, and marrying of his eldest daughter. There were also other things due to him, but kings always needed more money. So when the king would gather together enough people that would effectively represent the realm, he would ask them to give him a special amount of money, usually for a certain purpose. And this is reflected in a way in the form of the writs of summons to Parliament today, although today it's a pro forma thing of arduous and urgent affairs concerning a state and the church, I believe. But I'll pop in exactly what's said just here.
Whereas our Parliament, for arduous and urgent affairs concerning us, the state and defence of our United Kingdom and the Church, is now met at our city of Westminster, we, strictly enjoining, command you, upon the faith and love by which you are bound to us, that, considering the difficulty of the said affairs and dangers impending, waiving all excuses, you be personally present at our aforesaid Parliament, with us and with the prelates, nobles, and peers of our said kingdom, to treat and give your counsel upon the affairs aforesaid. And this, as you regard us and our honour, and the safety and defence of the said kingdom and church, and dispatch of the said affairs, in no wise do you omit.
Understandably, the community gathered together had the upper hand, and they would not only give advice to the king, as was their duty, but they would also withhold money until certain grievances of theirs were redressed. That's the context in which the abbeys, which by the time of the Norman conquest and beyond became quite wealthy, would be summoned. In fact, in the late 13th century, the king, or the king's regents rather, in wanting to get the largest possible number of people to agree to pay these taxes, in fact even summoned the lower clergy, the priests. Although this didn't last. What ended up happening after the 13th century was that the two convocations chaired by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York for the southern and northern provinces would tax themselves. All that happened in Parliament was the bishops would be summoned and some abbots, or some monasteries I should say really. There ended up being 5 monasteries that were summoned directly by the king, whereas all the rest of them would be summoned by the bishop in whose diocese they were. These 5 monasteries were Waltham Abbey, Westminster, St Albans, Glastonbury, and Bury St Edmunds. And you'll notice that a couple of those would later on become bishoprics in their own right. Just in terms of pure constitutional history, the reason that we don't have abbots and priors in Parliament today is because these abbeys and monasteries were abolished or were dissolved in the 16th century. So there were just no more bodies to summon. This is in contrast to in Scotland, where the monasteries that were summoned to the Scots Parliament, which was unicameral, before they were dissolved, they were able to send representatives of their own who were not ordained to Parliament. And with the abolition of these monasteries, these people who held this representative role for these abbeys would somehow find their membership of Parliament transformed into a hereditary temporal lordship of Parliament. So, for example, when St Andrew's Cathedral was dissolved, there came about a Lord St Andrews, as an example. But anyway, this didn't happen in England. What did happen after the dissolution of the monasteries was that some of these monasteries were converted into cathedrals. That is, they were made the seats of bishops, and these were new bishoprics. These were Chester, Gloucester, Bristol, Oxford, now Christchurch, Oxford, Peterborough, and Westminster, although Westminster only had one bishop before the see sort of went into abeyance. The number of Anglican bishops stayed the same for quite some time. However, just before the Civil War really started kicking off in the 17th century, they were abolished. The bishops were removed from Parliament, and this was the last regular act of Parliament passed in the Commons and Lords and assented to by the King. Shortly after, however, the Lords themselves were abolished, and it was only after the Restoration of 1660 that the bishops were explicitly put back in 1661, and they had to be put back in because they were legally taken out. The reason they were put back in is, in my view, to get things to be how they were before. The new experiments with the Constitution of having only a House of Commons and then an attempt to make a kind of King, Lords and Commons type thing didn't work. And it was thought best, in my view, to go back to the way things were before, which meant Lord Spiritual. In terms of numbers of Lord Spiritual, the union with Scotland in 1707 didn't add any to them. This is because, as I previously said, the Scottish Church is run by presbyters, elders, and not bishops. Later on, however, the union with Ireland and the creation of the United Church of England and Ireland as the established church did produce additional Lords Spiritual. Originally, in the Irish House of Lords in Dublin, these bishops had seats. There were so many of them, however, and there was an idea not to flood the new United Kingdom House of Lords with an enormous number of bishops, and this is the same thinking that led to the creation of representative temporal peers of Ireland and Scotland, that only 4 bishops from the Irish part of the United Church of England and Ireland would be representative members in any one parliamentary session. Now, a parliamentary session usually lasts a year, so it's essentially there would be a different rotation of bishops every year. There were 4 archbishops. If you imagine a table that looked like this, they would be in one column, with one archbishop serving every 4 sessions, effectively every 4 years, and then 3 of the 18 bishops serving every 6 years. This was massively complicated. In the 1830s, there were Irish church reforms which, amongst other things, reduced the number of bishops by combining dioceses together. Still, somehow, the rotation system managed to work, just about, I think. The Lords did ask for a report to make sure that the right Irish representative Lord Spiritual was in fact in Parliament. By and large, the numbers were only increased by 4. However, throughout the 19th century, the Church of England started to reorganise itself by creating new dioceses. This was because the population had exploded in certain areas, mainly industrial areas, and the then current church structure simply wasn't good enough. There were many new dioceses added until, in 1854, there was again no desire to have a ballooning number of Lords Spiritual. When the bishopric of Manchester was erected, it was decided that the number of the English and Welsh Lords Spiritual should be capped at the 26 that there were at that time. And this started the system of seniority. The new Bishop of Manchester would have to wait for a vacancy in one of the 21 spaces by seniority in order to be summoned to the House of Lords. And in this sense, this enabled there to be much more freedom in the erection of many new dioceses in England and Wales, or specifically in England. Shortly after this, however, the Gladstone administration disestablished the Irish part of the United Church of England and Ireland, and so from the 1st of January 1871, there were no more representative Irish Lords Spiritual. A generation later, Lloyd George's Liberals managed to disestablish the Church in Wales, now known as the Church in Wales. This only had 4 bishops at the time, and I think at the time of disestablishment, which was in 1920, it was originally the Act was passed in 1914, but the implementation was delayed until the end of the First World War. I believe all 4 Welsh bishops, that of Bangor, St Asaph, St David's and Llandaff, were in fact members of the Lords at the time, so I think that made 4 new spaces. It looks as though only 2 bishops were introduced shortly after that, so I may be wrong, but I think that's the case. The number of dioceses swelled quite a lot, especially in 1926-27 when a final new batch were created. It was only in 2014 that a new diocese was created, that of Leeds, but that was made by combining the dioceses of Wakefield, Bradford and Ripon together. The final change with the membership of the Lords Spiritual is the decision to start ordaining women to the episcopate. If you want to see the exciting debate on the church measure about ordaining women to the diaconate and to the priesthood, then I've got those on my secondary channel, and I'll link them in the description. I would recommend having a watch and a listen to them.
Your Lordships will be aware that this measure is one of the most significant pieces of church legislation ever to be presented to the House. It reaches here following extensive debate and discussion, not only within the Church of England, but more widely. Its passage has been accompanied by controversy at virtually every stage, including most recently the unsuccessful action by the Church Society challenging in the courts the General Synod's competence to pass the measure.
I should just say, for the first time, and I'll probably say this many more times, Lord's proceedings were audio recorded, and then sporadically video recorded, and then permanently video recorded. So, hence why one of them is just sound and the other is visual. What happened when the Church decided to start ordaining women bishops was that it was feared that it would take a very long time, waiting to be one of the 21 most senior bishops by length of service as a diocesan bishop. It was feared it would take far too long for female Lord Spiritual to start appearing in the House of Lords. So what was originally a 10-year case of what is known as positive discrimination, extended by another 5 to 2030, women bishops, instead of having to wait the seniority queue to become one of the 21 Lord Spiritual by seniority, they instead jumped the queue. So this has got many more women bishops into the House of Lords far quicker than otherwise would have been the case. One thing that the Lord Spiritual do is they take prayers before every day of Parliament. Now, these were never meant to be recorded, but I stumbled across an accidental recording of them, audio recording, from the emergency session of Parliament that met after the Falklands invasion. And if you want to hear what the parliamentary prayers sound like, or sounded like in 1982, then again, please check them out on my other channel.
The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord, have mercy upon us. Lord, have mercy upon us.
Bishops are full members of the House of Lords. They tend to attend less often than the temporal members, the non-bishops, essentially because they have a diocese to oversee. And these dioceses are all over England and not necessarily based in London. Although many of them did have former palaces and houses in London, just as other members of the aristocracy did, to be near court. Whitehall Palace, what became Whitehall Palace, was originally built by Cardinal Wolsey as Archbishop of York. But yes, the Lord Spiritual are full members of the House. However, because of ideas of separation of church and state, perhaps, or these sorts of things, there are always, I think they tend to be a bit more timid or apologetic in the way that they interact with Parliament. And whether they need to be is another question. The last significant piece of legislation, possibly the last piece of legislation introduced by a bishop, was in the 1980s by the Lord Bishop of Birmingham, Hugh Montefiore. Now let us turn to the second category, the hereditary peers. And as I said, I'm trying to get this out just in time. The hereditary peerage took a very long time to develop. I mentioned that Parliament initially was about gathering people together for advice, or gathering the wealthy together to agree to pay taxation. Now again, if you go way back, you find that the same people who are giving advice are those leading the army. And this is the case probably in, for example, the Carlisle Parliament before the expedition north. This was in the early 14th century. But in general, this seems to be the case, that the king would gather together a muster of his barons or his men, because that is after all what baron means, and these musters would be pretty indistinguishable from the parliaments. I think these modern ideas of the separation of things into very strict legislature and for example, judiciary or other things are modern ideas. These modern ideas are not very helpful when looking at the origins of these institutions. The sort of people that would be summoned to give advice to kings would be their earls or their aldermen, who would look after the local county courts. They had a role in presiding over them, and they got paid with a third of the profits of the county courts. So that would be the fines and such like that. When I say county courts, I don't mean the modern county court system. I mean the ancient shire assemblies that really are the old moots, or the old withans of the pre-United England Saxon kingdoms. I would say they still sort of met and they still decided things. For example, I think in 1002, so long after the unification of England under Athelstan, the East Anglian local council, shire court as it were, decided to pay Danegeld independently of the whole kingdom. It's impossible to give hard and fast lines or rules as to stages of development in terms of the constitution. The other sort of people that would be invited to give advice and counsel and go to war for the king would be the thanes. There are some fantastic descriptions of thanes as being a famous thane in the mead hall, or a thane serving his lord. This is in an anonymous Saxon poem, and Bede gives us some fantastic imagery of a thane asking a local bishop, after the local bishop had consecrated the thane's church, that you must come in to the mead hall and have dinner, which I think is quite evocative. Thanes, as with all people until the industrial period, relied on land to provide their wealth. They ultimately had the job of providing good counsel and leadership in war, and for providing soldiers for the king's armies. You might think this sounds a lot like the Norman barons. Very broadly it is, although with the feudalisation, if I can use that term, after the Norman conquest, the barons were far less powerful than the thanes. The thanes of the Saxon era were more independent, whereas the barons had all really been put there by William the Conqueror. And of course there have been various times throughout history when the old aristocracy is wiped out and you have a new aristocracy that's loyal to that king, and then slowly they start to inherit the land, which is what gives them their wealth, and they grow more independent. To answer the question, why is aristocracy hereditary? It's precisely because of this land owning. Land is where the wealth was, or cultivated land, I suppose I should say. And because it was possible to inherit land, and frankly I think a natural thing, the wealth that the land provided would head down the generations. Because the king had given specific people this land and this wealth, with the idea that they had responsibilities to him, this is not just saying go and be a despot in your local area. This is, you must cultivate your land properly, run it properly, deal with the disputes of the people on your land, but also come and give me advice and provide that money for my purposes, which are the same as the purposes of the state. And also, you are to come and with enough soldiers that I tell you to kit out and provide, and lead them in war. So I just want to be clear, the whole point of the feudal system, it's easy to describe it as giving people unlimited and unfettered power, and we have all these ideas of prima nocte, which is pure propaganda, I will say. This feudal relationship works both ways, and the barons had certain duties that they had to fulfill. The sorts of people who were summoned to Parliament were described as X Lord of Y, and this is using the term Lord in the same kind of way that we would say landlord today. They are summoned not because they're a lord, which sort of wasn't really a thing yet, as it were. It wasn't a peerage title. They were lord of a feudal manor. They owned such and such castle through which they could defend a surrounding area. They had these estates with various stages of free and unfree men working the land. And these people they had to look after. Slowly, over time, as you had more weak kings and stronger aristocracies, kings started to fight their barons. This happened, as we all know, I'm sure, under King John, which resulted in his conceding Magna Carta and the Forest Charter, but it happened later as well, especially under weak kings like Edward II, who he was the one who was allegedly snuffed out with a red-hot poker in Berkeley Castle. Interesting connection with Berkeley Castle, because much later on there's an argument that that was a feudal barony instead of a peerage one, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Essentially speaking, Parliament consisted of enough wealthy landowners who were given instructions to attend. It was not just these barons, these men, but also the earls who had a specific job, just about. When you got to the time of the anarchy under King Stephen, so this is the mid to late 12th century, there were two rival claimants to the throne, Stephen and Matilda, who was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, so she was called the Empress Matilda. And as they fought with one another for control of England, there were various people who would extract promises from them, and they would try and buy support by granting titles like earldoms. And there's a fantastic set of grants and regrants of the earldom of Essex with even greater privileges than the last grant during this time. It's clear that earldoms, which in the Saxon period used to be officials running the courts and mustering the armies of the specific counties, which after the Norman conquest were either killed or replaced with only earls on the border areas of England, an earldom now became more of a thing that could be granted. And this is presumably the first in a very long series of steps that led to titles becoming purely titular. After Edward II's reign, there was a list of people who were to be summoned to Parliament. And as I've said, this changed depending on either where Parliament was going to meet, or where the council, rather, was going to meet in the country, changed according to various circumstances, even things that we can't really tell. It just seems as though there needed to be enough of these people summoned. However, from the end of Edward II's reign, the aristocracy was so powerful that they managed to fix the list of writs of summons, a writ of summons being a document sent out to someone to instruct them to attend Parliament. Because the list of writs were fixed, that effectively creates an hereditary aristocracy. And as I said, people were summoned as lord of such and such a feudal place. As these honours, or baronies as they eventually would become known, were inherited, this effectively started to make a hereditary right to be summoned to Parliament. As I said earlier, people didn't originally want to come to Parliament because it was all about extracting taxation from them. You wouldn't want to spend a huge amount of time and money travelling all the way to wherever Parliament would be just to agree to give away some money. However, once Parliament and the aristocracy got the upper hand, it became more of a privilege, more of a right, rather than more of a burden and a responsibility. I'm simplifying things immensely, as it's still possible in the 14th century, even the 15th century, to give your title back to the king or to resign it. Overall, when you had periods of strong aristocracy, their rights increased. Periods of weak aristocracy or weak parliament, and this was essentially 1415 onwards all the way to about 1603, during that time you don't get much solidification of the aristocracy. The reason Parliament was weak during that time is because the Commons, who by 1415 had the sole right to grant taxation, to make the grants of money that Parliament was assembled for, and therefore this effectively sets up the supremacy of the Commons so many centuries later, the Commons were so grateful to Henry V for his victory at Agincourt that they gave him a grant of money perpetually for the rest of his life. And then they proceeded to do that for all the subsequent monarchs, only stopping with James I. So through that whole period, with all the Tudors as well, Parliament didn't really have to meet that often. There were very few titles created at that time, and the aristocracy was kept very small, and I think relatively weak. The thing is, though, is that any king wants and needs to get new men, new skilled men, into their service. With a system that's pretty hereditary, such as was faced by Edward III, following the stereotyping of the list of members, effectively, of Parliament, he had to get new men in somehow. He couldn't make them barons, but he established a means by which you could kind of make them baronets, sort of little barons. And this distinction was observed for a while in the writs. You would have the newer baronets and then the old barons, but eventually it didn't matter. They were all referred to as barons. The way this would happen would be essentially by giving people enough land and therefore enough wealth as they climbed up the ladder of service to the king. So eventually they'd be summoned sporadically to more minor councils and then eventually to full parliaments. Now again, I'm sure people will have an issue with what I'm saying here. I'm glossing over it a lot. But the point is that after the fixing of the old writs, in order to make new titles, you effectively had to make them into barons and aristocrats. Note at this time, though, that it was always possible to make new earls, or rather, you'd have to take away an earldom from someone, such as happened in, the early 12th century, and then you could give it to someone else. An earldom was still more like a job or a position, and dukedoms, when they came in the 14th century, were based off of earldoms. You have the higher titles, which is specifically created by a king or position offered by a king almost, and then the barons, who were more of a kind of social status, as it were. And bear in mind at this time that it was not possible to devise your land by will. Land was inherited in a very rigid way, and the rules had to be followed. This is, again, it's not as though, well, you could sell such and such land to someone else. I mean, you could, but you had to use legal fictions. In Scotland, however, it was possible to sell land and therefore your title, which would give another person a seat in Parliament, frankly, all the way up until Union in 1707. It much more reflected the real distribution of wealth in the country, more so, I should say, than the system in England, which, as I'm about to say, the seismic moment was in the 1380s, 1386, if I remember rightly, when Richard II wanted to create a new baron. As I've said, kings could make earls, dukes. Richard II made a marquess, made it up, effectively. But to make a baron, this was quite audacious, and he issued letters patent, so these are open letters to be read by anyone, that he preferred his steward of the household to the estate of baron. Very clunky wording, but he managed to do it. There was another creation of a baron shortly afterwards in Parliament, and it seems like when Parliament all meets, it was possible to be made a peer. But that, in the 1380s, that was the seed of the downfall of the House of Lords in terms of political power, because eventually it was accepted that kings could create peers, effectively out of nothing. Now, there's a lot of social status and snobbery and all this sort of stuff, and ideas that there had to be a certain amount of wealth behind a peerage for someone to live a certain lifestyle, and I'll get onto that later. But the fact is that the king could create a baron. And this is the crucial point. The way he created a baron was to be like the barons there already were. Barons already were summoned because of the land they held. And as I said, firstly it was because they were enough wealthy people who held enough land, they were summoned to give advice. But then it became, after the list of writs was stereotyped, that only these barons held baronies, and only these baronies would give you a right to be summoned to Parliament. Richard created, John Beauchamp of Hatch, a baron in the same style as the barons that there already were. This was hereditary and based off of the creation of earls and dukes and such. And the letters patent describe how this descends to male heirs. And this is because women in the post-conquest period were not summoned to Parliament. This changed with hereditary titles in 1963, although women had been attending Parliament a little bit before as life peers, but I'll get onto that later. That's another section of this video. That sets the mould for hereditary titles. It's not that they are made to be hereditary, and that's an innovation. It's that titles were already hereditary. They're limited to heirs male because dukedoms and earldoms and such were also limited to heirs male, and they were limited, I think, because only men could be summoned to Parliament. Now, none of this is very hard and fast. There are cases where women would sort of inherit titles, but not really. It was not figured out until much later. But these are the germs that create the hereditary peerage. And the peerage is so because they stick together as a class. They defend their interests. A key point of being a peer is judgment of one's peers. This mirrors the way that it used to be in the Saxon county or shire courts or the hundred courts, where the freemen of the hundred or county, they would be effectively the jury, although in the jury effectively replaced them. So you can think of them as being a class of gentry, almost, who had power to deliver judgments collectively. In the same way, the peers of Parliament, as they would slowly become known, had this sole right of judging one of their own. And this is a total parallel with the constitutional structures at the time. And as a fun fact, it was these freemen of the shires or boroughs or cities who eventually had a role in summoning representatives of the shires and boroughs and cities and the Cinque Ports to Parliament. The way it worked was the freemen would choose the 2 discrete knights of the shire or other representatives. These are where you start to get MPs from, but that's not what this channel's about at all. This is about peers, so I shall get on with it. I've mentioned that it's possible for kings to create aristocracy, but during the Wars of the Roses there was a Neville, Duke of Bedford if I'm not mistaken, who found himself effectively on the wrong side of politics. He was the underage son of the brother to Warwick the Kingmaker, so I think that shows you how high-level politics he is. He had a huge inheritance and therefore could have been a very dangerous person this is the late 15th century. However, in very brief, there were political machinations. He ended up on the wrong side of politics, and it was decided instead of killing him that he should simply be not made a duke anymore. And so he was approaching his majority, he was approaching being 18, and Parliament contrived a judgment that because he hath not nor never will have the means to support the estate of duke, it was to be removed from him. And this idea that you have to live a certain way as a duke, and you have to live in such a greater way as a duke than maybe a mere viscount or something like that, I think was a powerful social idea. And it did have some currency because, after all, it was possible if you were very poor as an hereditary peer, because, after all, the land and wealth might not follow the titles, because land is inherited by heirs general rather than heirs male, as titles tended to be. You might end up not attending Parliament, or even be asked to resign your title back to the king so he could give it to someone else who was wealthier or perhaps more deserving, a different branch of the family. The reason I bring this up is because this is the final stage in the development of the hereditary peerage. After the Civil War, when the House of Lords itself was abolished and then restored in 1660, there were a couple cases of people resigning their titles to the king. And this was allowed in the 1620s before the Civil War, but afterwards I think the peers quite sensibly wanted to keep their political power and control. 2 things have happened here during the Civil War. One is that the feudal basis of peerage was abolished. I mentioned that Parliament, or the Commons, had stopped granting the Stuart kings infinite subsidies for the rest of their lives. Well, not infinite, but subsidies for the rest of their lives. And so Charles I, instead of doing what most kings would have done, which is summon a parliament and redress grievances and get money, decided to try and make do without. He tried to call a feudal army, also tried to extract ship money, amongst other things. There was the Court of Wardships and Marriages, where he effectively really milked people's inheritance, I suppose you could say, is probably a polite way of putting it. But ship money he gathered not only from the coasts, but from as far inland as humanly possible. He called a great council, was viewed as essentially Parliament without the MPs, so just the Lords. He tried all these things. The Great Council recommended calling a Parliament, unsurprisingly, which he eventually did. What happened under the Commonwealth was that the feudal basis of peerage titles, which had really been a dead letter for a while, was officially abolished. However, because this was not regularly passed legislation, it was obliviated come the Restoration, but redone. So the 10 Years Abolition Act 1660 officially converted what were originally this idea of a feudal relationship with responsibilities into something that was purely about membership of the House of Lords as defined by the letters patent that create titles, which is hereditary. From 1660 onwards, legally, peerage titles all about membership of the Lords. Now, shortly thereafter, I mentioned there were a couple of cases of people giving their titles away. Considering that's all you've got is your title, possibly, and your title is disconnected from your wealth or anything else, really, most of the time at least, the Lords decided in the 1670s that no, you couldn't give your title away anymore. A title was created, and when you ran out of male heirs, then it was extinguished. But that's it. And it's from that point in the 1670s that the hereditary land-owning responsibilities are converted into purely titles, titular titles, I suppose you could say, and only about membership of the House of Lords. So at this point, you have the 5 ranks from top to bottom: Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, and Baron. There are still the old titles that follow female inheritance, but women can't sit in the Lords. And really in the 18th century, you start to see, although you of course saw this before, but it's quite famously so, you start to see the creation of titles to prop up certain governments or prop up the administration, because parties hadn't sort of fully developed yet. I think that it's important to note that the hangover of feudal responsibility, of noblesse oblige, and of the idea of having a country seat, which really descends from the idea of, well, you control this castle in a certain area, so you control the area. Well, that being an aristocrat means you have to have a seat somewhere out in the sticks in the country or whatever, and forgive my affectation there. But I think it's very notable, and it should be emphasized, that the old feudal ideas of duty have carried on despite the fact that titles were purely titular. Now again, not everyone was like this, and you'll get all sorts of corruption and everything. Of course you will. In fact, this is the era of old corruption. But I think it's important to underline the positive ideals of the system, which are frankly very different from the ideas that we have today. And it's during this period that we face the 2 acts of union, that of 1707 with Scotland and of 1800 with Ireland. And I mentioned the spiritual representative peers, but of course there are temporal representative peers as well. And for the same sort of reasons, the Scottish aristocracy per capita, I believe, was much larger than that in England. The old English and new British peers didn't want to get flooded by a bunch of Scots. So in 1707 there was instituted a representative system of, I believe, 16 Scottish peers who were elected at the same time as the general elections. They were elected per parliament. Unfortunately, this being the era of old corruption and not really having the same sense of, I suppose, propriety as nowadays, the administration tended to get the Scottish peers that it wanted using bribery. And I know we look down on it now, but it was more normal then, although people did complain about it. These Scottish representative peers continued to be elected all the way through to 1963, when the Peerage Act enabled all Scottish peers to sit. I suppose there were by then enough British peers that the total over about 130 odd Scottish peers wouldn't be swamping them out anymore. Although they probably, I think they would have back in 1707. The same principle happened with the Irish peers, except for some reason it's a completely different system. Instead of electing for Parliament, they were elected for life. There was a big election of, the 28 Irish representative Lords Temporal were elected for life, and then any by-elections that occurred for passing or bankruptcy were filled. And this went all the way up until the creation of the Irish Free State, the ratification of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and all that sort of stuff in 1922, when no more elections could occur, so those that were there continued sitting for the rest of their lives. That was the last one passing in the, 1960s. Now, the Irish peerage is a little bit of a postscript. They wanted to continue to be members of the Lords. They were a peerage without a parliament. And so the Earl of Antrim and others sent a petition to the Lords, a legal claim, requesting to restart these elections for representative Irish peers. They thought they were onto a winner, is the impression I get, but unfortunately the ruling was no. You can't represent Ireland anymore because there's no such thing as Ireland. It's been split and partitioned, and somehow you couldn't represent Northern Ireland, I suppose, because that wasn't in the statute. In 1971, I believe, in fact, the parts of the Acts of Union that created the representative Irish peers were removed from the statute book. And with one final attempt from Lord Farnham, where he claimed that his grandfather, by virtue of continuing to sit after 1922, created a barony in error, was rejected. And if you want to see the rejection of that, with a full debate that does include some more detail from very learned peers, then again, another video I've reposted on my secondary channel, which I've got a link to.
Because in fact, the barony from which the noble Lord Monkswell's amendment descends was in fact a barony to sit in this house for life. That's all it was. And it didn't give any right of descent at all to per se to its successors.
Well, Viscount sits down. Could he read to the House the last sentence of the Article 4th, following upon the reference to peers of Ireland enjoying privileges of Great Britain, a sentence which he didn't read, which I think your lordships may find relevant. Perhaps I might read it for him. But they shall enjoy all the privilege of peers of Great Britain, the right and privilege of sitting in the House of Lords, and the privilege depending thereon, and the right of sitting on the trial of peers, only accepted.
A barony by error. This requires a little bit of explanation. I mentioned that there were lords who were summoned to Parliament. This is way back at the start, back when it was all connected to land. Kings started making peers by letters patent. There had to be some rule, and this is worked out centuries later, but effectively the question was asked, well, I know that Lord Mowbray, for example, is a Lord of Parliament. He's been summoned, and his ancestors have been summoned. Of course he's a peer. Or Lord Delaware, for example, of course he's been summoned all these years. But where's the document that creates his title? There are two things that are going on here. These old summonses were based on the way land is inherited, and that's not just heirs male but daughters as well, but all equally, so they split up. So, for example, if you are Lord Blackacre, and you have two daughters, it's unclear how the inheritance would work. Eventually, and I'm skating over hundreds of years of history with this to get basically to the 1660s sort of post-restoration peerage law decisions, it was decided that your title would go into abeyance. Each of your two daughters would have 50% of the peerage, and if one passed, then the other would have 100% and would be a baroness, although not summoned to Parliament until 1963, based on the hereditary title. The Crown could also determine the abeyance to one of your daughters or their heirs, and there are all other ways that female inheritance was dealt with. Either you had husbands sitting in right of their wives' titles and all these sorts of things. That did happen for a bit. An end was put to that under Henry VIII, if I'm not mistaken. To answer the question, well, what document created this title? And this is asked hundreds of years after the fact. The answer was, well, the earliest possible writ of summons, and Cook, the great common lawyer, added the rule of, with evidence of having obeyed the writ of summons and sitting in Parliament, a writ of summons itself, with evidence of sitting in Parliament, creates the title. And this is a much later thing, and you can see how ahistoric it is, because back in the period, post-Norman conquest, William the Conqueror was not creating peers with all the rights and everything that a later peer would have. He was summoning his barons to give him counsel and taxation. But anyway, as I said, this is a much later view. There were two things about this. Firstly, created peerages tended to be heirs male only, although you can get special remainders to either nephews or fathers, brothers, or through your daughters or something like that. Because of inheritance, this was done earlier on, maybe the 14th century, they would contrive to lose the document that created their peerage titles, so that it would eventually be it must have been one of these old peerages by writ, as opposed to a peerage by letters patent. However, much later on as well, the way that peers who are, say, earls or higher are summoned was they'd be summoned in their baronies. And you'll notice that created higher titles tend to go to heirs male. The old peerages by writ can be inherited through the female line. So just say you have, I don't know, earldom, you have a certain earldom, and it just jumps to a cousin. Fine. The last earl only had daughters. Those daughters would all inherit collectively the peerage by writ. They wouldn't inherit the peerage by letters patent that had jumped. However, sometimes people made mistakes. And in summoning the new earl, it would be assumed that this old title was actually, the old barony, was by letters patent, and therefore they would be summoned in the barony. This means that you have someone who's given a new writ of summons for a title they don't have. They sat by the title. It was, as I say, it was a mistake. No one meant to do it. But this, according to the rules worked out post 1660, means that you've created a new barony by mistake, a barony by error. And the argument, effectively, by Lord Farnham was that by continuing to sit after 1922, when he had no right to do so, or his grandfather, that is, that there would be a new barony in error made, and that's therefore a British barony to heirs general, that would give him and his descendants automatic membership to the Lords, at least until Blair would kick them out at the end of that decade. So that's just to explain what's going on with the writs in error. I think I need to talk about women as well. This is going to be unpopular, I know. There has been some suggestion that some abbesses were summoned to a parliament in the 14th century, although this was a time when people wouldn't want to come to parliament, so they might not have come. They might have sent a proctor, a representative. Either way, it might not have been a full parliament. There's a lot of politics and debate about that in general, as you can see. And I suppose you can see now, just as an aside, if you could prove that you had a writ of summons to a full parliament, well, you need to define what a parliament is for these purposes. So there's a lot of politics around that. Also, just as an aside as well, if you want to see all the audio and video recorded determinations of abeyance, which are by custom considered by the Lords and debated in Parliament, there again, got some playlists on my second channel. I will say, though, there's a really good one. Unfortunately, it's audio, not video. Barony of Grey of Codnor, or Codnor, as he says, Lord Wilberforce delivers a blinding explanation of what I've just said, way better than what I'm saying in this video, but he explains how abeyance works.
My lords, I feel that a little explanation, not in the nature of a lecture, I hope, but a little explanation is necessary to your lordships in this case for two reasons. First, there has not been a case of an abeyance brought before this House for 50 years. And not all of your lordships, I think, were present at that time. Secondly, the case itself is a bit unusual, if not startling. The abeyance itself has lasted for 493 years, which is not a record. There has been found a case of 547 years. But one must agree that even by the standards of your lordship's house, 493 years is rather a long time.
Women, essentially by common law, couldn't attend the Lords. And the Sex Disqualification Act, 1918, if I'm not mistaken, or 1919, basically said, if it is only that you're a woman means you can't have a public office, then that is removed, and you can have public office. Viscount Ronda, who, forgive me, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his title, he was a Welsh industrialist, and he had a daughter, and he insisted that he wanted a special remainder on his peerage to go to his daughter. And generally the way these work are to your daughter and heirs male. So another, just an example is Bass Ale, drink of the empire, I believe is probably the best way of describing it, because it did get broken up in the 60s actually, so possibly that may be very apposite. It was the Bass family. This is their sort of title succession, as it were. It was given with special remainder to the first Baron's daughter, and then her heirs male. This is a common special remainder. Viscountess Rhondda, she decided to try to claim membership of the Lords by virtue of the Sex Disqualification Act. And she went to the Privileges Committee of the Lords, which decides these things. It looked at first as though she'd get in. They thought this is probably right. But then the Lord Chancellor, Lord Birkenhead, commonly known as F.E. Smith, of Shovett Smith infamy about the disestablishment of the church in Wales, decided that actually that wasn't properly law. And he's portrayed, I will say, he's portrayed as this hyper arch-conservative, fuddy-duddy, sort of arch-reactionary type figure. He was going strictly on the law, and the way the special remainders are drafted is it gives the holder the right of attending Parliament, and then says so it grants you the dignity of Viscount Rhondda, and then also and your heirs male, and then failing that, it will grant your daughter the dignity of Viscountess Rhondda, saying nothing about the membership of the Lords, or in fact, I think maybe explicitly mentioning that it doesn't grant membership of the Lords, and then grants her heirs male the dignity of Viscount Rhondda with membership of the Lords. So he was being very specific, but he did have legal reasons for decision in Viscountess Rhondda's case in the 1920s, which said that no, the Sex Disqualification Act doesn't allow women to sit in the Lords. I believe there was a Lord Quibble, who was a Labour peer who had a daughter who tried to claim his title after her father's death based on the I can't remember exactly what arguments this is, and I need to look into this, but apparently that was the case as well. It failed. However, under the Peerage Act 1963, all female hereditary peers can sit in Parliament, and so you see a lot of the determinations of abeyance to women enable them to sit in Parliament, at least until the automatic membership of hereditary peers was taken away in 1999.
My Lords, I have to inform your Lordships that Her Majesty has been pleased to terminate the abeyance of the Barony of Strange in favour of Jean Cherry Drummond. The barony has been in abeyance since the death in 1982 of her father, John, Lord Strange. A writ of summons has been issued in pursuance of Section 6 of the Peerage Act 1963, and the noble lady attends at the bar to take her seat.
I'm sure that people are not going to like that. It's certainly not modern at all. But that is the history with women in the House of Lords. And I suppose I should just say as a final note that in the old Saxon gatherings, there were often queens and female members of the royal families of the Saxon kingdoms who did witness charters. So if you want to go way back, women were in one of the predecessor institutions of what would become Parliament. So hereditary titles constitutionally continued to be granted all the way through the 19th century, and there were a couple ideas about reforming things with life peerages, which I'll get onto next, and they continued to be granted all the way through until the accession of Harold Wilson's Labour government in 1965. At that point, there were life peers, and Wilson wanted to reform the Lords completely by phasing out the hereditary peers. This failed, however. This is a story for another time, and he continued to only grant life peers. Heath, likewise, only life peers, and Labour again. It got to Thatcher in the 80s, in the early 80s. She decided to try to revive the practice of granting hereditary titles. She had 3 granted. 2 of them were de facto life peerages because they had no male heirs, not unlike the Labour Party's was it 1923 government, where they had to put in some people into the Lords to pass legislation, and they chose men with no sons because they opposed the hereditary principle. The third person was Harold Macmillan, former Prime Minister, given the customary earldom.
Style, dignity, title and honour of Earl of Stockton unto him and the heirs male of his body lawfully begotten and to be begotten,
Since then, there have been no hereditary peerage titles granted to commoners. The late Queen, in fact, was the last person to grant hereditary titles at all. The last newly ennobled hereditary peer is Prince Harry with the Dukedom of Sussex, although she did also give Prince Edward the Earldom of Forfar. With the accession of King Charles, he granted his brother the Dukedom of Edinburgh only for life, which is quite fascinating. And of course, that does mean that royal dukes were members of the Lords because they had titles. And if you want to see Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester's 4 speeches in the Lords again, please see the playlist on my second channel.
I'm speaking this afternoon as President of St Bartholomew's Hospital, an honorary position that I hold with great pride, as did my father before me, and indeed Prince Albert in the days when so much was donated by private subscriptions.
Because hereditary titles had by and large ceased to be granted in 1965, when it came to the next generation of Labour governments, that of Blair in 1997, there was effectively a generational gap between hereditary peers who'd inherited their titles and life peers who'd been granted them. And I'll get onto life peerages later, as I say. But just to finish out the hereditary peerage membership, because you could so easily divide the Lords that way at that time, I think it made it even easier to do what Blair wanted to do, which was to remove the hereditary peers from the House of Lords. There's a few moments from the passing of the House of Lords Act 1999. Again, I've got another playlist with some of these moments. The long and the short of it is that Blair was unable to remove all of them. Some lords had threatened to gum up the works. It may also have been the case that Blair simply wanted to break the connection between heredity and automatic membership of the Lords. Either way, what ended up happening was that the hereditary peers in the Lords were decimated, and then plus a few extras. They were decimated according to party lines of the major parties at the time, the Conservatives, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the crossbenchers, and the numbers were all proportioned down. So, for example, the Conservatives had, I think, over 40, the crossbenchers around 30, 28, I think. The Liberal Democrats had 3, and the Labour Party had 2 spaces from which all of the Conservative, crossbench, Liberal Democrat, and Labour hereditary peers elected representatives to sit in. There was also an additional 15 members elected by the whole House, and these were to serve as deputy speakers and such like that. Apparently there was a fear of how the Lords function if some of its most active members would be removed. There's an idea that there's a transitional arrangement where some hereditaries would stay on. What ended up happening was that these representatives of the hereditary peerage, this decimation, was allowed to continue on. When one member would die, a group that elected him or her would be allowed to elect a replacement. And so the by-elections, after the initial elections, have continued on for about 25 years, until the accession of the next Labour government, this current one, under Starmer. Starmer's Labour government paused the by-elections, and I think this is because they were paused during COVID for many, many months. Although there's a requirement for places to be filled in 3 months, this was extended under COVID, and therefore you could extend it again. The hereditary peers who've retired or passed since the accession of Starmer's Labour government have not had their seats replaced, and these remaining, they were 90 plus 2 office holders, who I'll get to later, are to be removed under the current House of Lords Hereditary Peers Act. This will take effect very soon, possibly the day I'm getting this video out. But hence why I wanted to get this in, because the history is so long, and even after the removal of these hereditary peers, some of them will be given life peerages to stay on. The Lib Dems have ennobled 2 of their 5. The Conservatives apparently will have 15 life peerages. Even the crossbenchers will have some life peerages, which is quite remarkable. Their convenor, the Earl of Codnor, has already been given a life peerage, and this was mentioned in the discussions about their removal of the remaining hereditaries. It should be noted that this follows on, really, from what happened after 1999, when most hereditaries were removed. There were 4 Labour and 2 Liberal Democrat hereditary peers, that they didn't get to be one of the representatives of the hereditary peerage. They were given life peerages. And so there are, in fact, a couple hereditaries who are life peers for the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties. And after the passing of the 99 Act, there are some other hereditary peers. One is passed, the Marquess of Lothian and Viscount Hailsham, who were given life peerages because they're politically active in the Conservative Party. Well, I say politically active is probably putting it a bit lightly, but they were given regular life peerages. But today, the main membership of the House of Lords, and will soon be almost the only membership, apart from the Lord Spiritual, are the life peers. Life peerages, really, you can trace to the 19th century. Now, I know that there have been life peerages granted by royal prerogative before, and in fact there are certain cases of such and such to be held until you become another peer. But the life peerages, there was a call for reform of the House of Lords really from the early mid-1810s. What ended up happening, there was an attempt to introduce life peerages in the 1850s for the following reasons. Now, I've not talked about the functions of the Lords so much, but one of the functions is that they were the highest court of appeal effectively. I mean, I'll just sort of leave it at that. For all of the, by then, very professionalised common law and equity courts, and in fact some civilian jurisdictions as well. Again, this is all for another time. Because the judges were very professionalised, and there have been several points at which they became much more professionalised, but the 1850s there was the effective abolition of civilian law, and civilian law is a kind of, think of it as more of a continental international style law. So shipping laws, civilian, ecclesiastical laws, civilian, and of course, the High Court of Chivalry, which is all about arms and armorial bearings, is civilian law as well. Of course, the High Court of Chivalry was originally about the jurisdiction of military discipline abroad. So you can't, for example, have an English jury in anywhere in France start an action against a soldier who'd misbehaved, because there aren't any English juries in France. They're not in an English county. So it's essentially international law, if you think of it as sort of an international law. The High Court of Chivalry, shout out to the High Court of Chivalry, though, still exists. The Victorians forgot to abolish it. Last sat in the 50s. Extremely hyped. I would like to do a video about that soon as well. I'm sure others have, but I'll give it a go too. Anyway, point is that as things were starting to be professionalised, it became apparent that you couldn't really sustainably put capable judges in the Lords as hereditary peers, because what would happen is, of course, they would do a good job determining these legal cases, but their heirs might not. So it would be guaranteed that you would make a huge number of new hereditary peers whenever you needed some temporary knowledge or expertise. This seems pretty unsustainable. There was an attempt to create a peer for life, Lord Wensleydale, who was a Baron of the Exchequer, who was a judge. So a baron was a judicial office in the Court of the Exchequer. The thing is, there's kind of no nice way that you can say to the people who were doing, the best job they could, that actually they might need some help in determining these legal cases. It started out with a kind of foot-in-mouth moment. I think this was Palmerston, of not being the most tactical in the way you're putting this across. And then secondly, the Lords thought, hang on a minute, if you can make a life peer by prerogative, then you can effectively flood the Lords with people who you know to be loyal and not have to worry about their heirs, who might not be loyal. That was one of the ideas of the hereditary peerage, is that it creates a set of independent political dynasties who are therefore not in the pocket of whoever ennobled them. That's one argument. The Lords therefore referred the Wensleydale Barony to the Privileges Committee and decided that, well, it might make you a baron or a peer, it wouldn't give you a seat in Parliament. Following on from this, a couple decades later, or in fact a decade later, and then the numbers expanded over the years, the Appellate Jurisdiction Act put in 2 judges, just for the term of their office, to act as judges in the House of Lords. The reason that this was accepted was because there was a cap on the numbers. It was only 2, and then that was slowly expanded all throughout the decades up to, 2009, I suppose, really, when the judicial functions of the House of Lords were hived off under the Constitutional Reform Act 2005 into a new Supreme Court, so-called Supreme Court, but the numbers were slowly expanded to 12. And because there were limited numbers of these judges who later, I think in the 1880s, 1870s or 1880s, became full life peers and had membership for life. The purpose of this is you're putting in these experts just for life so that they can give their judicial expertise for the House of Lords in its judicial capacity. These are the Law Lords, and they, as I say, they have membership for life or retirement now, and they continue to be made up until 2009, when all new Supreme Court justices are given the, quote, title and style of Lord or Lady for life. Don't really get that personally, but, and they are called Lord and Lady, but they're not. So probably the most non-legally prominent one is Lord Sumption, not because he's a peer in the House of Lords, but because he is granted the title and style of Lord or Lady for life. Without wanting to go through the entire 20th century history of House of Lords reform, there were many different proposals for Lords reform in the 20th century, most of which, from the 1920s onwards, included the idea that there should be life peers. Eventually, and I'm skipping over a lot, the Conservative government of Macmillan did this in 1958, passing the Life Peerages Act. And for a few years, it was possible to be made a hereditary peer or a life peer. This meant that from 1958 to 1965, I think you could kind of choose, effectively. However, as I mentioned, Harold Wilson's Labour government came in and he stopped the practice of regularly granting hereditary peerages. Nowadays, if you're made a peer, it's going to be a life peerage. Could be hereditary, there's nothing stopping that, but it's going to be a life peerage under the 1958 Life Peerages Act. Constitutionally, I suppose not very interesting, really. Generally speaking, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and leaders of other parties get a certain number of peerages they grant, normally biannually. But things are all in flux, and I don't want to be too prescriptive about it. Generally speaking, it's in the new year, and for the King's official birthday, that there are peerage titles granted, generally speaking, not always, and there are some people or some positions that bring out a kind of ex officio grant of a life peerage, such as governors of the Bank of England, except the Right Honourable Mark Carney, OC, who I do personally think it's interesting he didn't get a life peerage for being governor of the Bank of England. I think that would probably have hampered his political career in Canada because he'd be Lord Carney, and I presume you could, it's not really a good look, I suppose. The other thing as well with Canadians is there's the Nickel Resolution of, 1917, where it's basically, we in Britain will stop granting Canadians British titles. This is after a load of Canadian industrialists got British titles, and I think there was an idea that, well, hang on, that's for a foreign parliament, not for us. What are you doing? There was actually originally, when Canada was merged and Upper and Lower Canada were united, powers were conferred in the act that did that to create a domestic Canadian hereditary aristocracy, which were never used. And then I think those powers were not given under Lord Durham's Act, which is the modern basis of the Canadian Constitution, I believe. Similarly, there was a proposal in South Carolina to make hereditary, landgraves, caciques, and barons, which didn't really come to fruition. But anyway, I'm going off-piste. The point is that nowadays you've got governors, ex-governors of the Bank of England, heads of the civil service, as in the Cabinet Office, also the Foreign Office, permanent undersecretaries, I think, in the Foreign Office. Generally speaking, archbishops of Canterbury and York, but again, Justin Welby, GCPO, has not got one yet, so I wonder what's going on with that. You've got Lord Chief Justices of England and Wales, so now the Lady Chief Justice of England and Wales, Baroness Carr of Walton on the Hill. is a life peeress, and the same with the now presidents of the Supreme Court. Masters of the Rolls, who are the heads of the civil courts, Lord Chief Justice, head of the, or Lady Chief Justice as we have now, head of the criminal courts. But Masters of the Rolls tend to get life peerages on retirement. And of course, any minister that is appointed from outside Parliament will get a life peerage to get them in Parliament so that they can face questioning in Parliament. However, I think the last time we had a minister who was not a member of either house was in the 60s for maybe 6 months or so. You tend to get some ex officio appointments, effectively, but Theresa May, or Baroness May of Maidenhead, has sort of said that there shouldn't be ex officio appointments. A lot of political appointments and some crossbencher appointments. There's HOLAC, House of Lords appointments. Can never remember if it's commission or committee. I should have looked this up beforehand, but I'm going off memory here. They are meant to appoint 2 crossbencher peers per year, I believe. But again, all of this is controlled by the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has the legal power to grant or refuse suggestions to him of peerage grants. But in practice, and in the British Constitution, practice and custom counts for a lot. As I've mentioned, HOLAC will have a say in some peerage grants. Other party leaders will have says in other peerage grants and such like that. So a lot of politics, a lot of politicians, some experts. You will always get some donors. You will get some sort of officials, as it were. And I think that, frankly, that brings me on to a very good seg for the final of these 4 categories of membership of the House of Lords as of right now, which is those of the miscellaneous officials. The reason I don't include this as hereditary peers is because it's technically different. I'll be very quick on this. These are 3 offices. Firstly, Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain. This is a former office, used to be the Speaker of the Lords, is no longer since 2006. And if you want to see the Lord Speaker taking over from the Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain, video I've reposted on my second channel is in the description. Secondly, you've got the Earl Marshal and Hereditary Marshal of England, and these are the Dukes of Norfolk. And if you want to see a Duke of Norfolk who inherited after 1999 with the general exclusion of hereditary peers, give a speech, his maiden speech in the Lords, being a member by being Earl Marshal, you can see it in my as I post on my other channel.
My lords, I must start by saying how honoured and humbled I am to be making my maiden speech. I will admit to a touch of nervousness, but I can't tell you what a relief it is to be able to enter your lordship's house today, walking forwards, not backwards.
You've also got the Lord Great Chamberlain. This rotates around different families for each reign. Currently, the deputy exercising the office of Lord Great Chamberlain is Lord Carrington, who was already by-elected to be a member of the Lords. Very briefly, the Lord Chancellor has been called a standing rebuke to Montesquieu. Now, I've got a lot to say about Montesquieu, but I'm going to say that in another video. The Lord Chancellor is a cabinet member, so he's part of the so-called executive, or really it's part of the government. He's a Speaker of the Lords, so he's part of the legislature, or really he's in Parliament. Really, that makes sense, because there's a certain expectation, I suppose, of impartiality placed on him. He was a judge in the courts, and there are Lord Chancellors who became law lords, for example, and so he's part of the judiciary, or really I suppose you could say he had different roles in His Majesty's Court, a High Court of Parliament, and other lower courts. He also, in fact, appointed certain, I think may still appoint, certain priests to certain benefices, so he's really in all 4 parts of government. The Lord Chancellor was this very difficult to describe position. Being very capable lawyers, Lord Chancellors are law officers. They have a loyalty to the law as well as to the government. They would be a kind of quasi-independent legal defending voice in Cabinet. I think it's possibly the best way of saying it. Nowadays, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, I suppose, offers a kind of similar position, but Lord Chancellors were, before their position was effectively destroyed, and it's just become a sort of minor, stepping stone on the sort of ministerial cabinet ladder, had this extremely difficult to describe, gentlemanly restrained role that worked very well. And all I would say is, if it weren't for the Constitutional Reform Act that shattered the role of Lord Chancellor and made him into a cabinet minister in the Commons, I don't think that LASPO 2013 could have happened, and LASPO is the cutting of legal aid. So I'm just saying, if you had a strong defender of the legal system in cabinet, who knows how things might be different. That's kind of by the by. Lord Chancellors didn't actually need to be members of the Lords, and if you want a really good example of that, we've got Sir Michael Havers, who's Lord Chancellor, I think it was 1987 for a year. He did some ceremonial stuff as Lord Chancellor, but he didn't speak in the House, and then only the day after that was he introduced as a Baron and as Lord Chancellor. Infuriatingly, this is only audio recorded.
Do by these presents advance, create, and prefer our right trusty and well-beloved councillor, Sir Robert Michael Oldfield Havers, Knight, Chancellor of Great Britain, to the state, degree, style, dignity, title, and honour of Baron Havers of St Edmundsbury in our county of Suffolk.
As I mentioned, a lot of the early Lord Chancellors were bishops. This is almost as close to an official membership category as you could get of the Lords. The final two are other exceptions in the 99 House of Lords Act, getting rid of most hereditary peers. It was space for 90 elected ones, as I've described, plus 2 office holders. The Earl Marshal, who originally dealt with the army and now is reduced to a sort of highly ceremonialized sort of organizer of state events and pageantry, and head of the College of Arms, and essentially whose court the High Court of Chivalry is. The Earl Marshal, amongst other things, organises the state opening of Parliament and the coronations. The Lord Great Chamberlain originally dealt with, I think, all royal palaces, and then slowly, over the centuries, just the Palace of Westminster, and then this was reduced even further by Harold Wilson in the 1960s to really just Westminster Hall and the Chapel of St Mary Undercroft, which is not really an Undercroft, but that's a story for another time. You've got the common spaces that aren't controlled by the Speaker of the House of Commons, or now the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords, formerly Lord Chancellor. These are the purview of the Lord Great Chamberlain. So you'll see whenever Sovereign visits Parliament for an address or something like that, or whenever anyone visits Parliament to address Parliament, you will probably see the Lord Great Chamberlain with his white stave and fantastic court uniform. These two officials, so the Earl Marshal and Hereditary Marshal of England is a hereditary in the Dukes of Norfolk. The Lord Great Chamberlain is a complete mess of inheritance. Very, very long story short, it faced female inheritance 3 times in its history, and different decisions were made each time. So first it was just heirs male, then the second I think it went to like the eldest daughter and then her husband, and then the third time there were 2 daughters, and it alternated between these 2 daughters per reign of monarch. So I mentioned earlier where you have the old baronies by writ that go into abeyance. This is effectively a way of dealing with that. And then one of the daughters has a male line that continues on. So every other reign, they get to be the deputy exercising the office of Lord Great Chamberlain. But the other one has had, there have been further splits in the line. So you have all the way down to someone has the right to do this 1 in every 100 reigns. However, there was an agreement in the 1910s that this would just alternate between 3 families in different reigns. And currently, we've got Lord Carrington, who's the deputy, who's not actually blood-related to the other Lord Great Chamberlains, but nonetheless. Every other reign, it's the Marquesses of Cholmondeley. And then I think it's Baroness Willoughby de Eresby, who will be the other line, but we'll see how that works. We'll see how that works. Now, the thing is, both these officials are going to lose their automatic rights of membership to the Lords. However, there's a guarantee that they will continue to have access in some form. So my assumption is that they will automatically get granted parliamentary pass that will let them onto the parliamentary estate so that they can be present and scope out the way that the ceremony should be done and organise the ceremonies that they organise in future.
Like everybody else, thank you very much for all the support you have given us hereditaries, and I still will be here, but sitting on the steps of the throne rather than on the chamber.
This does seem to be slightly at the whim of Parliament now, though, which is an interesting thing. It's no longer a statutory right, but this guarantee was given from the dispatch box, and as we all know, guarantees from the dispatch box
binding in honour
are always adhered to. I hope you'll excuse my immense politicisation of this. My only excuse is the whole thing's immensely politicised. You can't be unpolitical about it. But I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's informative. I hope I get it out in time. Thank you very much for this. Please let me know how I did. If it's rubbish, please let me know. I want to make this enjoyable and useful. So, see you next time. This is Wood on Piers.